Okay, we're going to get started today. So thank you everyone for joining the University of Texas Energy Institute's Energy Symposium for today, April 5th, 2022. I'm Carrie King. I'm Assistant Director and Research Scientist here at the Energy Institute. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'm going to discuss the upcoming talks that are coming the next 2 weeks. So we have next week, we're going to have a panel discussion on ESG investing and the future role of oil and gas in the global energy mix. So we're going to have Caslin Kennedy as VP of Corporate Communications for Apache Corporation, and Leslie Beyer, who's the CEO of the Energy Workforce and Technology Council here in Houston, Texas. The week after that, we'll have a talk from Dan Cohen, who is a professor of civil and environmental engineering, and he's written a new book. So he's going to talk about his book, Confronting Climate Gridlock and Technologies to Unlock the Clean Energy Future. But today, it's my pleasure to host Will Paxton and Max Toom here from Volkswagen North America. And I'm going to give a brief presentation, a summary of them. So they're going to talk to us about Beyond the Plug. Volkswagen Group innovation is looking at the future of energy systems. So that is Volkswagen Group is part of the subset of Volkswagen that they're a part of. So as many of you know, Volkswagen is one of the world's largest automakers and heavily involved in battery electric vehicle development today. They see them as offering a cleaner alternative to internal combustion vehicles and lower lifetime cost of operation and a lower carbon footprint. So with the goals of carbon neutrality for the company, they need to better understand the fast evolving energy systems that change the car's batteries and power their operations. So this talk will give a high level overview of how Volkswagen Group is viewing energy systems of the future and how it affects mobility. So our speakers today, Will Paxton, he's a senior scientist and the project lead at Volkswagen Group of America's Innovation Center. It's based in Belmont, California. So he works as part of the technology scouting and strategic programs team on topics including state of health of lithium ion and other batteries, machine learning, artificial intelligence, EV charging, sustainability, energy systems, and he has a PhD from Rutgers. Joining Will is Max Toom. He's a mechatronics engineer at Volkswagen Group of America's Innovation Center in California as well. He has a master's degree in automotive engineering from Ingolstadt, Germany. He's leading and contributing to research initiatives within their automotive space related to EV charging, decarbonization, renewable energy, and vehicle cloud infrastructure. So with that said, I'm going to stop sharing now and hand it over to Will and Max, and I will tell everyone, as usual, please post questions at any time into the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we'll hold questions until the end. So please enter your questions there at any time. And Will and Max, thanks for joining us, and go ahead and start your presentation.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm going to need you to.
We got to give you that button.
Yeah. Sharing. Great.
All right, not doing my job. Go for it now.
So again, Carrie, thank you for the great introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to University of Texas at Austin for hosting us here. So today we're just going to give a little bit of a brief insight into how we're looking at the future of energy systems. No need to introduce ourselves again, but I do want to introduce this vehicle on here, which was just revealed a few weeks ago in Austin, Texas at the South by Southwest conference. This is the newest of Volkswagen's vehicles on the MEB platform called the ID Buzz. So to give you an agenda today, we're going to introduce the company, talk about our group and the brands that are contained within. We'll introduce you to our division of the company, which is called Group Innovation, talk about some of our strategic fields of action, and specifically connected energy systems, which is the one that Max and I support. Then I'm going to hand it over to Max, who's going to dive into a research topic, talk about emissions tracking and adaptive charging for electric vehicles, some work that he's done over the past couple of years. So first of all, I'd like to say that we represent Volkswagen Group of America. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of Volkswagen AG. And really, this contains operations within the US for our distinguished and exciting brands. That's Volkswagen, Audi, Bentley, Bugatti, and Lamborghini, as well as VW Credit. We were founded in 1955, headquartered in Virginia. But as you can see from the map on the right, we have operations across the United States, bringing together over 6,000 employees, and in addition to that, 1,000 independent dealers. And lastly, with great mention is our assembly plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where they're building cars like, where they're ramping up to build cars like the ID.4. As a whole, the Volkswagen Group is a large conglomerate of many storied automotive brands and other brands and supporting business units. This includes, for our volume segment, Volkswagen, Volkswagen Commercial Vehicles, Skoda, Seat, Cupra. For premium vehicles, Audi, Lamborghini, Bentley, and Ducati. And then in sport category, all alone is the Porsche brand. Additionally, some other brands of note are Cariad, which is our software organization, Group Components, which supplies many of the key components to our vehicle brands. Elli, which is our energy services division in Germany, and Electrify America, which is our high-speed charging network here in the United States. At a glance, here are some facts and figures. We are by far the largest automotive company in the world by employees with over 660,000. All of us are working together to deliver vehicles, and in the year 2021, we delivered 8.8 million vehicles around the world. This comes to if you calculate, it's a staggering number every day. So it's truly a unparalleled manufacturing scale. This is carried out at over 120 production plants throughout the world. I think one of the key things that we'll be talking about here is the entire Volkswagen Group by 2050 aims to be carbon neutral. It's a massive task. On our way there, by 2030, we will have launched approximately 70 all-electric car models. More on our sustainability commitments. We have a policy called Go to Zero, and this is about our commitment to the 2-degree goal of the Paris Climate Agreement. In addition, an interim goal that we have coming up soon in 2025 is to reduce our total life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of passenger cars and light-duty vehicles by 30% compared to 2015 values. We are also actively contributing to the transition to renewable energies, and we are one of the first automakers to build out renewable energy production facilities aside our plants to support their production. When we look at group innovation, the department that Max and I are from, this is really our group that is based all around the world. And our goal is to develop new technologies, intellectual properties, and ideas for the brands with the brands. So we're working collaboratively with all the brands you see here. And we have an international footprint. We have 3 innovation centers, one in Wolfsburg, Germany, one in Shanghai, China, and the one where I'm talking to you from today in Belmont, California. In addition, we have innovation hubs located in Knoxville, Tennessee, Tel Aviv, Israel, Singapore, and Tokyo, Japan. In addition, we work with many different research institutes, universities such as University of Texas at Austin, startup companies, and research divisions within Tier 1 and other non-automotive companies. This slide shows our strategic fields of action for 2022. As you can see, it's a broad range of topics that are addressing core concepts within the vehicle, but also beyond, addressing beyond the vehicle to society. Up top, we have our 4 strategic lighthouses. These are Go Sub-Zero, Go Fair, Go Far, and Go City. And below, we have our strategic fields of action, including connected energy systems, which I'll talk further about. So this is our connected energy system strategic scope. Really what we aim to do is to provide a 360-degree assessment looking at ecosystem, technology, and business factors for energy demand, energy management opportunities, both locally in Germany and abroad. Look at the infrastructure, both centralized and decentralized, and to build a technology portfolio where we can identify disruptive trigger points. This 360-degree assessment is looking at generation, such as wind and solar, but also topics like fusion, nuclear fusion. We're looking at conversion in carriers, such as hydrogen gas, storage technologies beyond just for the vehicle, but for the grid. Also distribution, trading and contracting, charging, e-mobility, user experience, and of course, new business opportunities for the group. Our approach is to enable the best strategic business decisions by this 360-degree assessment. And really what this is we're doing energy systems modeling and simulation, as you can see here in the center. Our inputs are coming from our group stakeholders, as well as our international network of innovation hubs. We're all conducting technology scouting in those strategic areas and building and developing forecasts for those systems. In addition, we're leveraging existing energy simulation tool chains. When it comes to our modeling and simulation platform, we're taking a 360-degree perspective and also providing holistic assessments, including factors as social, technological, environmental, engineering, environmental, policy, and legal. And we're looking at energy technologies, interfaces, and systems. On the right-hand side, you can see we're looking at e-mobility, our production facilities, the digitalization trend, and also negative emission technologies. For e-mobility, we're looking at charging and bi-directional charging topics. For instance, we see that the energy transition will be needed to enable full e-mobility, but at the same time, we see e-mobility as a facilitator of that transition. For our production facilities, we're looking at ways to decarbonize and to decarbonize our operations. For digitalization, we see this as a large energy sink, but at the same time, those technologies are critical for managing energy systems of the future. Our output is to provide impact analysis on our core business and new business models. This is through roadmaps for the systems and technologies, and also to provide co-innovation and venturing opportunities, such as proof of concepts, energy labs, and living labs. With that, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Max to share more on this exciting topic. Please excuse us while we switch presenters.
Okay, thanks, Will, for the introduction on our group innovation. I'll go over a research topic that we have been involved in about emissions tracking and adaptive charging for our EVs. We'll start with some motivation, kind of our why, our purpose here. Then we'll dive into an example on tracking emission from different charging events, how we do that, how we shift windows in time to make sure we can track the lowest possible footprint. And as the last topic, we'll talk a bit about average and marginal carbon intensities and how they play a role here. Starting what Will already mentioned with our Go to Zero and the commitment to our Paris Climate Agreement, which is, I think, really a great purpose that currently drives our innovation and also our company forward. Is our Go to Zero campaign here. We need to get away from burning fossil fuels to consuming 100% renewable energy. And I'm a big fan of those Sankey diagrams from the Lawrence National Laboratory, because you get such a great overview on what actually happens in terms of energy in the United States here. Not so much concerned about the units here real quick, but so it's in quads, so it's 1 quadrillion BTUs, which is roughly 293 terawatt hours. But I think it's a great overview on where this energy is actually coming from, where is it processed, and where it's actually ending up. And as you can see here, our transportation sector, to no surprise, currently heavily relies on petroleum. And this is what we want to change when we want to get away from burning fossil fuels. So the plan is to plug in that entire sector and to rewire it basically to consume electricity. And by that, we can effectively reduce our carbon intensity. But what we also see is the electricity generation currently still heavily relies on natural gas and coal, for instance, here in the United States. So that's the second very important step now, to focus our newly created demand that we are now deploying into that system to make sure that we match that as good as possible with solar and any renewable technologies basically that are out there. So we need to make sure that this newly demand matches the generation capacities. So again, for the current situation, it's not only the automotive sector that is rewiring themselves, right? It's many other sectors as well, but choosing electricity as their new clean energy carrier. The transportation sector is one of them, with our switch from internal combustion engines to battery electric cars. But now we need to make sure, since that electric energy generation varies greatly in carbon intensity depending on the availability of renewable sources. So what we need to do is align our energy demand with the availability of those renewable sources. And we're doing this by influencing our demand. We decide when to charge our cars and when not to charge. So this way, we effectively reduce the carbon intensity of our operation. We also support the deployment of more renewable energy generation capacities. And hopefully we can also leverage that for our customers in terms of lower electricity costs that currently often align with high shares of renewable energy production. When we talk about charging, that's a statistic that we got from our colleagues in Germany, where we see roughly on a fleet level 5% of high power charging on highways. Those are one of the demands that we can't really influence. At that point, you really need to give the customer the opportunity to charge as quickly as possible. There's a 25% of public charging. Currently, we're not addressing those charging events either, since we're not trying to avoid to block charging spots for longer times of period when there is other customers in need to desperately charge or so. In that chart, we also see a 20% workplace charging scenario. That's something which is a little more likely to also influence our demand and shift charge events, since that's a more controlled environment. But mostly we're focusing currently on the home charging event with here, it's addressed with 50%. We're also discussing that in the region here, where we probably rather see 80% of those charge sessions happening at home. But again, that's very dependent on the driving profile and obviously on the charging opportunities for that customer, that vehicle. For the next simulations, etc., we'll focus mostly on our home charging scenarios. So we're asking ourselves, what is the CO2 footprint, and can we track that as precisely as possible, not just on a yearly basis, but really per charge session. And what we see here is driving our charging schedule of an Audi e-tron over a 2-month period. So on the x-axis, basically the columns of that grid are representing the signal or specific days across a 2-month period. And on the y-axis, the rows represent the hours of the day. So we have those 24 rows basically going from top to bottom. The blue boxes now represent when a vehicle is actually at home. So when there is an availability or opportunity to charge. What we did at the beginning is overlaying now this standard charging schedule, how that vehicle was originally being charged. So on Monday here, on the very left corner, it came home, 9 p.m., was plugged in and did charge and finished at 1 a.m. at night. just here as an example. The next step was that we got a very detailed hourly resolution mapping on our carbon intensities here for that specific region. In that case, that's California, where you can see that during the day, you have more clean or access to more clean electricity, so lower carbon intensity. That's represented with the brighter green blocks here. While at night, the electricity tends to be a lot more carbon intense here in the region. So what we now can do basically for each of those hourly blocks, we can calculate 6 kilowatt hours that car was charging at home for this level 2 charger, and then multiply that with the carbon intensity level in California. So at night, this might be around 300 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So basically we get for each of those blocks, we get a carbon intensity or a gram CO2 basically for that specific hour. When we now sum this up across the entire 2 months, we end up with 236 kilograms of CO2. The next goal now is to look for those charge sessions and for those windows, how we can basically shift those forward to see how we better align those with the availability of low carbon electricity. And by doing so, we achieved in that example here roughly a 16 kilograms reduction, so roughly 220 kilograms of CO2, so a 7% reduction in the footprint here. So in that example, we did talk quite a bit about the footprint. So basically the responsibility that we all share when consuming electricity at a certain point in time. The next data point that we wanted to look at is actually the impact that we are having by shifting demand from one time frame to another time frame. And that is something that we did work together with WhatTime. WhatTime did provide us with marginal carbon intensity signals for different regions. And we want to see how that applies for a fleet of cars. So we don't want to look at one car, but now at 100 cars and see what the impacts are. So just to remind everyone, average carbon intensities is basically what my footprint is, what is my responsibility, and the marginal carbon intensity is by shifting demand from one time frame to another time frame, what is basically the impact that drives on the system-wide scale. As I mentioned before, we did look at different regions. First region here is California. That's data from the Energy Information Administration, from the annually generation by state report. When we look at California, roughly 43% of renewable energy electricity generation. And from that, the largest source here is solar with 37% compared to only, I think, 16% of wind. The other region we wanted to look at was Kansas, similar amount of renewable share than California at 44%, but basically entirely wind driven. And the last region is one with a very high share of renewables at 75%, so a very decarbonized grid already. This is achieved by a lot of hydro electricity with 88%. We did increase the sample size from 1 car to now 100 cars. As we said at the beginning, we're still looking at the home charging events for leveraging the flexibility that we have. This is now 100 Audi e-trons, and the time frame is now extended from 2 months to a year. So it's July 2019 to July 2020. On the right side here, you see a representation when those charge sessions are actually active across those yearly period. And it looks very typical for a home charging scenario where you see most of those charging actually happens at night when those cars come home and being plugged in. We're now starting with California for the first optimization. We can optimize our charge schedule for average carbon intensity values. And by doing so, we can already see that from the blue shaped curve, and we're now pushing our charge sessions more to the very early mornings when those cars might still be home. And by that, we're reducing the footprint of that fleet, roughly 26 metric tons of CO2, so 12% reduction across all those cars. On a per vehicle basis, it's 100 cars, it's roughly 260 kilograms per vehicle per year. When we now optimize the same fleet according to a marginal carbon intensity signal, the demand curve looks a little different. You can see that very dip in the early morning around 4 or 5 a.m. That's still when demand is fairly low in the grid, so marginal emissions are also lower at that time frame. And then we end up with a saving of 48 metric tons, so a reduction of roughly 50% on overall CO2 impact. Now, it's very important that we can't compare the two numbers, since they both address different effects in the end. For Kansas, maybe remember that's the wind-driven region, almost 200%. On the average signal, there's a potential to reduce the CO2 impact or the CO2 footprint here by 21 metric tons, so 7% reduction. The even more interesting part is here the optimization based on this marginal signal again, where we can see that a lot of those charge events are bundled in this very early morning, around 3 to 5 a.m., reaching 107 metric tons of CO2 reduction, so almost a 30% reduction potential in overall CO2 impact, which is most likely due to a lot of curtailment happening at night and such a grid region that's so wind-driven. The last region is Washington, so the region where we already have a fairly decarbonized grid on our average carbon intensity values. We can again see also this very spike in the early morning. We probably still have a lot of wind in the early nights. So we see a reduction of only 1.4 metric tons of CO2, just due to the high share of renewable energy that's already there. The percentage change is still similar, it's around 7% on the footprint. And on the marginal signal side, so on the system-wide impact, we did roughly reach 20 metric tons of CO2 and CO2 reduction on the overall system-wide output. The conclusions here is that adaptive charging can strongly influence the EV's CO2 footprint or overall CO2 system-wide impact that we are having by those load shifting events. As you've seen from the different regions, there's quite a huge amount of difference between the different load and energy demand curves in the end. So when we do any of those optimizations, it's definitely very important that we do those based on those regions and maybe even scale those down even further based on the data availability that we have. What we want to do next is we look towards more the long-term implications on those optimizations. So how do those influence any future capacity plannings on those different grid regions? The goals are for us always the same. We definitely want to avoid any curtailment events. Marginal emissions or a marginal emission signal is a great tool to do so. So we need to not waste any of the renewable capacities that we already have or the potentials that we can already get. And we also, again, still want to support the maximum renewable energy shares for each of those regions. And another point that is very important here, I think, is this data-driven approach. I think Will also mentioned it at the beginning for any of the bi-directional charging scenarios. We want to know at what point in time does it really make sense to trade energy between a vehicle and a home, because in the end, we also want to decarbonize other parts that are beyond just the vehicle. And I think all those data-driven approaches will definitely help us drive those decisions forward. And with that, I would hand it over to Will again. Will, I think you're still muted.
Thanks, Max. Thank you for that insight into the exploratory work that we're doing, simulating and modeling new ways to change charging behavior to accommodate more renewable energy. Just some key takeaways from both of us here. So Volkswagen Group is a world leader in automotive and committed to sustainable mobility. We are leveraging our global network to provide energy system insights and support our transition to carbon neutrality. And we're working to enable maximum utilization of renewable energy for electric vehicle charging. With that, I'd like to say thank you. Here's our contact information if you'd like to get in touch with us. And I'd also like to take the opportunity again to show some of our colleagues there at the South by Southwest Festival in Austin. We're sorry we weren't able to make it there in person for this talk. But if anyone's interested in joining us, please go to the website, Volkswagen Group of America, and go to careers. There's a lot of great options for early career, mid and late career, as well as internships across a lot of different business units for those of you who are interested. And with that, I'll say, yeah, if there's any questions, we'd like to hear them and try to address them. And thanks again.
Thank you very much, Will and Max. So yeah, good overview of what you're working on. So yeah, we do have a few questions, and I think some thoughts came to my mind as well during the presentation. Sure. So I'll go to this first one, which is kind of it's on the emissions and charging. This is a general question about emissions trade off from petroleum to electricity, and is this gonna it's maybe an often asked question. Will this shift encourage an increase in coal usage since it's might be cheapest in some places and has more emissions besides greenhouse gas emissions and contaminants? So I know Max was I think this question was put up before Max was discussing the different areas of the US, but any other insights you can give us into how this helps reduce coal emissions, how it might be different in Europe or Germany versus the US, and anything you're looking at? Or?
Yeah, I think there's a pretty good report that was published, I think it was last year, from BANF on the costs of new capacity that we deploy in different markets. And I think they stated that 2/3 of the developed countries, wind and solar capacities are already cheaper setting up new coal-fired power plants or gas-fired power plants. So I think I would disagree here on the fact that this would drive more coal-fired power plants to be deployed in those regions.
Right. I think we had a presentation from Jessica Trensick, MIT, a few years ago, and she was talking about carbon emissions from cars. And I think most of the studies, or pretty much all of them, show even with a coal on the grid existing, that the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are less with electric vehicles. So, all right, thanks. Here's a question.
There is definitely this optimization potential, right? So I think this is definitely still what we need to push for, to align as best as possible with the availability and the opportunities to harvest renewable energy. I think that's a super important point. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the important point of what you were showing. So here's another question regarding the studies that Max was discussing. How do you determine the marginal resource in your case studies? And here's a sort of add-on to that question. For example, your California, let's just state the fact California imports electricity from other states. And so how do you think about the electricity generation consumed, or the electricity consumed in a state of the US, for example, versus where the electricity is generated? Are you accounting for imports and exports? How complicated do we need to get on that?
Cool question. Yeah. So based on our data points that we get from different providers, when we do our footprint calculations, we always take into account the consumption-based carbon intensities. So those are considering imports and exports. And that's definitely the right choice to do. We cannot, I think imports and exports in California are around 10%. So it's not the biggest influence, but it's definitely something that we want to take into account when we calculate our footprints.
And if I may add, I think it's important to recognize that this was simulation work that we did to understand what the benefits of these adaptive charging technologies could be. We worked with Watt Time as our signal provider for those marginal cases, but as we look into the future, we see stronger partnerships with the grid operators to understand, to the extent that they can share with us, what are the marginal power plants, or what are the power plants that are operating at the margin, those carbon footprints and also costs, so that we can work more closely to find those windows of flexibility in our customers' charging events to better align with those grid operations.
Now, here's a question on essentially consumer behavior. So are you doing any work? I don't think you presented anything related to consumer behavior, but is that of interest to your research group? And are you doing anything on trying to understand consumer behavior of EVs? I don't know, and how, any insights on, if you have any, on how it's different in Germany or Europe versus the US?
I think the question is really, or Will, you want to take it?
Sure. I'd just like to say that I think this is a really fascinating topic. When we're developing products, we usually have sample load curves to simulate what's happening out in the field. But ultimately, the decisions on how we drive our vehicles and when we decide to charge them influences the loads that we see. And so everything, I think, is tied to customer behavior. And this is something that we are definitely working to understand. Maybe not so much our group, but especially some of our colleagues. And so we certainly recognize the importance of that. I think with the work that Max showed, we went with the assumption that we don't want to change the behavior, just if the vehicle is at home and connected to a charger, as long as it's easy to say, going back and say, well, it was plugged in for so many hours, so we can delay the charging. But certainly understanding when people will need to just unplug and go is incredibly important for understanding how we can actually shift those charging event windows.
Okay, thanks. I think definitely a great question, right? Because I think the user experience for all those applications is key. So I think I would always envision that as with minimal user interaction as possible. I think you as a user, you want to know that your mobility demand is covered for all of those scenarios. And if you get to choose that, if you plug in your car and VW or any other of the providers is basically scheduling your charging based on lowest carbon intensity, lowest cost, etc., all those factors, I think that's kind of key. So I think little user interaction and biggest benefit for the customer. And on concrete projects, and because you were asking about Europe, and I think Will also introduced it at the very beginning, we have this subsidiary called ELI, which stands for Electrify Life. They're already rolling out our first prototypes on doing exactly that, where customers just put in their timer. Basically, I need this car charged to 70% in the morning, and basically driving that routine. And then the load or the charging happens then automated based on that, with lowest carbon intensity. And the more often those customers are actually participating in those events, there is a monetary incentive which drives that.
Right. Can you say something else on that monetary incentive?
That's not my research group. I'm happy to find that out. I think the app is called Naturstrom Connect. So Nature Electricity Connected. So if you go to the App Store, I think you should find an app there. It's only available in Europe and only for customers from ELI. But yeah, I think it's very similar to what you see here in the Bay Area with GridShift and all those other applications. Yeah. Okay.
So the incentive is from ELI, the company, to, I guess, try to get customers engaged, and that's the level it's at right now. Okay.
Yeah. I think the difference here between Europe and the US is that in Europe, electricity providers are customer facing. So there's a private company that VW operates, which is actually selling electricity to its customers. That is something that we don't have here in California, at least, where you have still public utility companies. So there is not that link between the OEM and the public company that sells electricity. But that's a little different in Europe. Makes the case a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, right. So perhaps you have that a little bit more of that opportunity, say in Texas and ERCOT, where there's some direct customer to retailers. So yeah, it's different across the whole world in the US.
That's why we're also so curious on the university collaboration that we have, right? So to learn more about those opportunities.
Right. Here's another sort of a question, maybe along, customer usability, even though this is not your areas, but it's just about V to G or vehicle to grid aspects of using cars. And maybe if you want to speak, you could speak on anything, vehicle to X or, vehicles connected to anything. But anything you can say about how Volkswagen is looking at V to X and how this relates to customer experience, or how far Volkswagen sees itself going in terms of having vehicles, perform a function besides just drive around, since we can plug them in and go backwards into the grid.
You want to take that, Will?
Sure. Yeah. So I think we've announced that in this year we'll be rolling out bi-directional charging capability in Europe, and we believe that that function will eventually come to the United States too. I don't think there's been an official announcement on that though. We're definitely looking at all of these use cases for exportable power from the vehicle, but I think Max and I are really looking at this from the innovation perspective, and so it would be other colleagues within the company who would be working on the product side of that to roll it out to customers. So can't really speak to that anymore. However, from the innovation perspective, we're very much interested in all of those use cases and how we can extract more value from the vehicle beyond just driving purposes.
Right. Okay. So to translate for the question asker, you said bi-directional charging. That would be the capability of the vehicle to enable V to G, to allow power to flow out. You already, essentially Volkswagen's already pursuing that in Europe. Here's a question on just fuel cells. Is there any kind of fuel cell or anything you'd say about Volkswagen's plan for fuel cell electric vehicles, or that sort of in or out, or to be determined? Or I don't know what you can say, if anything.
Yeah, from a technology standpoint, I think fuel cells can serve a purpose for certain vehicle types. I think it sometimes makes sense for larger vehicles, maybe heavy duty. I think we're primarily, when you look at our volume segments, we're focused on battery electric, but we certainly have a lot of expertise in fuel cell powertrain systems as well.
Right, thanks. So another question, this is maybe a question about sort of, I don't know, interacting in the home or something. Is VW Group developing, this is the question, is VW Group developing a Powerwall, quotes, type storage system to complement domestic charging apparatus? Or, I guess that's a question of, storage in the home versus storage in a car. Anything you can say on that?
I'm sorry, I'm not close to the product plans for that.
Okay.
I can't answer that. Sorry.
All right. So I have one question kind of related to Max's presentation. I don't know if it helped bring it back up, but when you're doing your marginal versus sort of average carbon intensity optimization comparisons, it looked like the baseline case, or whatever, the blue line, was different in the sort of the two charts, right? And when you marginalized versus, or when you optimized for average carbon intensity versus marginal, the blue line, the comparison chart, wasn't the same in each one. I was kind of wondering why that would be the case, or if there's insights you can give me into that.
So the blue line is always the base case, right? That's basically how the cars originally were available for any of those charging sessions, or the standard charging sessions. And just the yellow charts did reflect the newly optimized charge behavior. So the blue lines shouldn't be different. Maybe there was.
I thought they had different magnitudes on the y-axis. Maybe I was looking. All right, no problem.
No, I think what Carrie was saying was that when you calculate the emissions using the average versus the marginal, the magnitude of those emissions are quite different, especially in the case of Washington State. So comparing the blue line from the top to the bottom chart.
Yeah. I see. So I think that that's a very important topic, right? That we can't really mix up average carbon intensity. So what is my footprint? What is the share that I basically my burden when I consume high carbon intense electricity versus what is the impact that my load shifting scenario actually has on the grid. I think that's something which is really important to distinguish. So don't compare average carbon intensities with marginal carbon intensities. That's very different, even though the unit is the same. But the effect that they are measuring, that is very different.
Right. I was thinking if I had a baseline case and I charged a car, that the carbon emissions would be the same number, but you're telling me the way you're doing it is not necessarily. It's just the way I would think. I don't know. I'm not doing these calculations, so that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, can you rephrase the question maybe?
I mean, maybe it's just the definition of baseline in each case, right? The definition of the blue line in your upper part has a different calculation than the blue line in the bottom part of those charts. A different mathematical calculation.
So the base case is always calculated for each region specifically, right? So each region would produce a different baseline scenario based on that region's electricity generation. And based on that new region, then you recalculate your optimized behavior.
Right. Okay. Well, perhaps have to follow up on that question.
Yeah. Of course.
Let me see if I have any.
I think the to just add a little bit more insight, the way we addressed this was we looked back in time for the charging and grid intensities, carbon intensities on the grid during those hour segments for all the charging windows that we had. We had two ways of calculating the carbon emissions from those charging events. One was just looking at average grid emissions or average emissions from the entire that grid region, whether it was CAISO or others. And then we looked at if all of the charging was always at the margin, understanding that the marginal shift in emissions in some cases is much different than just the average. And so we found that looking at the marginal case, especially in the Washington region where most of the energy supply is from hydro, but then the power coming at the margin is from higher emitting sources. If we look at, that's why you see this large difference between the average and marginal emissions. And we still have some debate amongst us on which one of these makes sense. I mean, certainly if you're shifting charging from one time to another, we believe we're operating at the margin. So we should understand what are the marginal impacts of those small charging events. But when you look at the charging fleet as a whole, when you look at the entire fleet as a whole and you want to understand what's the carbon footprint from that, it makes more sense to look at the average, which is why we had the two scenarios.
Okay, I think that makes sense. So your average carbon is like you take one single number, CO2 per kilowatt hour, and you just multiply it by charging every single hour, that one number every single hour for your average carbon. And then the other one actually is tracking carbon emissions each hour. Okay, I think that makes sense. I think I'm kind of with you on, I've thought about this a little bit and it's not clear to me which metric I like better.
Yeah, I think it underlines that this is still ongoing work. And so, it's a tricky subject, especially because modeling those marginal carbon emissions is not always easy. And the signals we're at the moment working, with watt time to get those signals, but certainly having better signals and better data could help inform our operations. Right.
Okay, well,
maybe on that note, I think we also just learned that it's a PJM. I think they just recently started publishing a marginal signal also officially as a TSO. And I think that's also the way to go. I think in the end, that's a huge data and optimization problem. But data quality is key. So I think that's definitely something which is really important. But I also wouldn't see huge corporations setting up individual data optimizations for each of the regions. I think at the end, you need an aggregator in between that you can talk to for an entire country, like the United States or like in Europe, where you then can optimize your demand for that specific region, but also like more down to a specific GPS location. And I think there's many more use cases. It's not just EV charging, right? Any on-site storage, any home energy management system, any smart appliances, anything basically where you can do load shifting will profit from those signals. So I think it makes sense if there's an aggregator in between that is actually surfacing all that data. So I think that's a good choice.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I think I wasn't aware of that, PJM doing that. Do you know anything else about how often the signal they would expect to go out or anything like this?
Not yet. We just learned this last week, actually.
Okay, all right. Well, I just learned just now. So, okay.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, that's probably. I think I agree with you. I think that's probably the way to go. It'd be good for the ISOs to be the originator of such a signal for real time or in short term forecasting, I guess as well. Which is what they do.
Those ISOs do have all the information at hand, right? I mean, they are knowing the best what's actually going on their grid. So I think it makes sense if such a signal actually comes from them.
Yeah, they should have a good feel of marginal emissions for every power plant. So they should be able to get pretty accurate. Excellent. I think that was a really nice, insightful point there. I think it's a good point to end on. So again, Will Paxton and Max Toon from Volkswagen Group Americas. Thank you very much for being part of the UT Energy Symposium today.